Welcome, everybody. Is this mic working okay? Okay. Welcome, everybody, to this first talk in the Twin Flames speaker series. My name is Michael McQuarrie. I'm the director of the Center for Work and Democracy, which is one of the co-sponsors of the Twin Flames exhibit, which is on display upstairs here in the museum. I'm glad to welcome you to today's event, a celebration of the recent publication of H.L.T. Quan's new book, Becoming Ungovernable, an Abolition Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living, published by Pluto Press. Professor Quan is an accomplished and award-winning documentary filmmaker and scholar of radical thought. This book is being published in the wake of the George Floyd uprising of 2020, a moment when we were able to see efforts to practice many of the ideas Dr. Quan discusses in her book. It is for this reason that the Center for Work and Democracy, which has been involved in the community at the epicenter of the George Floyd uprising since the summer of 2020, invited Dr. Quan to launch her book as part of the Twin Flames Speaker Series. The Twin Flames exhibit, currently on display here, is a collection of offerings left at the George Floyd Memorial that have been preserved and curated by Janelle Austin and the George Floyd Global Memorial and Brittany Corrales here at the ASU Museum. The timeliness of Quan's new book and relevance to contemporary protest and activism made it a natural fit for this speaker series. Here to offer comments on Dr. Quan's new book is Professor Curtis Austin. Dr. Austin is the Associate Director of the Humanities Institute here at Arizona State University and is an Associate Professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion and of African and African American Studies. He's a scholar of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement and is the author of the award-winning book, Up Against the Wall, Violence and the Making and Unmaking of the Black Panther Party. Before we turn things over to Drs. Quan and Austin, I want to note the other two talks in the Twin Flames speaker series. On April 4th at 1:30 here, Diva Woodley, professor of political theory at Brown University and author of Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, will be joining us. And on April 25th at 1:30, Professor Rashad Shabazz will be joining us to launch his new book, Biography of a Sound, Prince, Place, and the Hidden History of the Minneapolis Sound. Please join us for these upcoming talks. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professors Quan and Austin. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much. And since you are so far away, I can actually take off my mask. I'm not going to forget that hat. Thank you. Okay, let me pull up my script. It decided to die on me. There we go. So this is a lovely space to be in. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Let me begin by thanking the Center for Work and Democracy and its entire staff, particularly Dr. Michael McQuarrie and our wonderful Mural Parado. They worked their butt off and made this happen. Also, obviously, the university's Art Museum. I am especially grateful and to the very generous and gracious colleague Curtis Austin for agreeing very short notice to be a commentator and discussant after my initial conversation on the book. Thank you very much. And so I'm in your debt for those of you who are here and for those of you who are also on Zoom, as well as everyone who worked behind the scene to make this happen. Big shout out for the folks on Zoom. You should know that I'm in an analog room, so there's no screen. I have no idea if you are even here. I think your spirit is here. Hopefully you're haunting me.
Dr. Sharif said, I see you, HQ.
Okay, I see you too. I see you too. I'm just sorry that you are not here in person to experience the Twin Flame exhibit. As Michael said, this is a collaborative endeavor between the Center, the George Floyd Global Memorial, and the Art Museum to bring the installation to Phoenix from, this is the first time I think it's seen outside of Minneapolis, so it's remarkable. Years ago, Angela Davis wrote this little wonderful book called Women, Culture, and Politics. And there's so much in that little book, especially from the essay entitled Art on the Frontline, Mandate for People's Culture, for a People's Culture. And in it, Davis reminds us that, quote, art is a form of social consciousness, a special form of consciousness that can potentially awaken an urge in those affected by it to creatively transform their oppressive environments, close quote. Indeed, as Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, and a host of other theorists, including Davis herself, have insisted that there is no question that we need our culture for subversive radical transformation. Or as Davis put it, if we are to move subversively into the future, well, I say the future, she said the 21st century when she said it, but that was in the 90s when she said it, you know what I mean? We have to update it a little bit. Anyway, if we are to move subversively into the future, we must certainly take our culture with us. All of this is to say it is a privilege to be in this space, experiencing the curated memories and offerings of mournings and protests from the George Floyd Square. So thank you to the artists and all the folks who are working so hard to make this installation possible for those of us to experience it who cannot physically be in Minnesota, Minneapolis. So I have been told that I have about 30 to 40 minutes. I think I'll be closer to 30 than 40. I don't have much to say. I wrote the book anyway. So I'll try to best capture some of the meanings and motivations behind this unruly book, as Robin Kelly refers to it. And I will also share some inspirations, the books, the people, the events that drew me to the project and accompanied me along the way. I guess in light of Lafleur, Claudine Gay, I should claim or announce or confess that I plagiarized myself and that I agree with Rebecca Sosi that knowledge claims are often fraught in discovery, colonial logic. And so I claim no innovation or originality, all right? So I went on record. Okay, you can't accuse me of anything. Okay, all right. So what is the book about? Well, I don't think it's an exaggeration or hyperbole to name our moment, this moment, as a time of pandemic, catastrophes, and wealth hoarding. Becoming Ungovernable is an investigation of contemporary political, intellectual, and cultural currents, mainly in the United States, but not exclusively so. My aim really was to provide a critical reading of anti-democracy and its siblings, namely the so-called new fascism and authoritarianism that threaten to replace the dying and older Western liberalism as a dominant order. Now, the book foregrounds critical scholarships, especially radical Black feminist thought and praxis, and interrogates episodes of rule refusals, from peasant rebellions in ancient China and slave revolts in the United States, to protests against prisons, policing, and despotic work conditions. My task here, I believe, not unlike my task as a scholar, is to subvert dominant histories and theories. So if successful, I don't know that I was successful, but if successful, this book is part of a cacophony, or an ensemble, if you wish, calling for democratic living and just present and futures. Briefly, the book is organized into two parts. Part one focuses on the metaphysics of governing, and part two centers on rule refusal, or living beyond governing. Now, part one highlights the ideological and political investment in white rule to show how white supremacy underwrites modern political thought and policies in the United States. It ends with a detailed examination of liberty as a concept to show the ways in which democracy and liberty have been conscripted for governing and undoing justice, not for liberation. Radical scholarship, including the works of David Walker, W.E.B. Du Bois, Cedric J. Robinson, Sarah Ahmed, and Dorothy Roberts, provide the analytics for undoing this anti-democratic thought and proceduralism in justice theorization. Now, the second part of the book extend the investigation. You're okay. Some of us are late. It's not even late. It's just on time. The second part of the book extend the investigation on the willful refusal to be governed by focusing on both real and speculative claims of liberation, taking up contemporary political thought, including transhumanism, although I had to cut the meat out of the chapter to get it published. So I'm still bitter, you think? I'm still quite bitter. Anyway, so transhumanism, black radicalism, practical utopianism, and abolition feminism as contending ideas and praxis for countering white supremacy, displacement, death by work, and other forms of violence, including and especially gendered violence. So in this way, the book disrupts linear temporality and spatiality by revealing contemporary sites of struggle for justice and solidarity, but also reaches back into ancient history for antecedents, both epistemologically and historical antecedents. So these scenes of subjections, if you will, and rule refusals serve as sites for elaborating on radical praxis of community and world crafting. Now, one of the things I did in part two that was also to disrupt the spatial and temporal dimension was to shift our gaze to a not so small place, namely contemporary and ancient China, for lessons, inspirations, and warnings. Now, given the rise of techno-autocracy, although now I understand people have taken to use the term techno-feudalism, whatever term float your boat, right? This new power that governs our life, given the rise of it, I thought it would be appropriate to look to the folks who are laboring to sustain that infrastructure and the tools of this particular governing regime. And so, for instance, in one of the chapters in part two, I explored the Foxconn jumper phenomenon. These are suicides by tech workers at Foxconn plants inside the People's Republic of China to explore rule refusals within the neoliberal labor regime of death by work. Now, I'm told I should read a little bit from the book. Well, I was hoping you'd do that on your own. But okay, here's a passage to share at the bottom of page 126, and I'll read it. If the first decade of the 21st century was marked by mass suicides of farmers in the global south, accompanied by evictions and foreclosures in the global north due to financial liberalization and debt entrapment, then the following decade's rash of suicides by Chinese tech worker at Foxconn, the world's largest electronic manufacturer and an important partner of the Apple empire, marks the disconnect between the brutality and seediness of labor and the fetishization of the new techno-aristocracy and its fantasy of augmented humanity. The exuberant anticipation of and enthusiasm for Apple's next shiny object is emblematic of this troubling development. Regardless of whatever the next fetish object might be, more than likely it will bewitch both the financial and techno press, ensuring Apple's ever-escalating stock prices to continue, close quote. So in addition to managerial authoritarianism in the workplace, I also take up the plights of migrant workers inside China, whose population in the manufacturing services and construction alone is estimated upward of more than a quarter of a billion people. So that's a lot of people, right? For comparison, the entire US civilian workforce is only 168 million people. Just let that number sit with you for a minute. So as it turned out, migrant workers inside China, like migrants elsewhere, they too have memories of resistance and dreams of liberation. And frequently, they people the tens of thousands of mass protests inside China, indeed annually during the first decade of the new millennium. So both parts of the book showcase the many stories of everyday people and community who creatively resisted, fought back, built, and rebuilt community in the face of oppression and domination. And a slow focus on the refusal to be governed allows me to reach into the archive of peasant and slave rebellions, of contemporary work stoppages in Chinese manufacturing plants, and of Black Lives Matter mass mobilization to make the case for grounding a new feminist ethic of care and liberation in the processual logic of solidarity, as well as the intimate metaphysics of friendship instead of rule, governing, and wealth hoarding. I should say that these are not systematic, comparative analysis of social movements or even protest tactics or strategies. I don't do that. I try not to do that anyway. Instead, it is more like a kaleidoscope of refusal praxis, where each chapter is anchored by one or more historical events, almost all episodes from the long history of resistance and rebellions against tyrannies, both big and small. Now, I'm not partial nor wedded to any orthodoxy, as some of you already know, and more or less promiscuous when it comes to methodological approaches. So the book travels through time and spaces as diverse as ancient China and Athens to contemporary Brazil, Puerto Rico, and the United States. And as I mentioned, I see the task of critical scholarship is to subvert dominant theorization and histories. So part of this means that I have no qualm with placing David Walker and Harriet Jacob alongside Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Locke, or Angela Davis and Sarah Ahmad with Aristotle, Marx, or Arendt as interlocutors. But part of this task is also involving in interrogating the unthought and the unthinkable of dominant episteme and ideologisms. And so from classical political philosophy of ancient Greece and Taoist utopian longings in ancient China to Jeffersonian anti-democracy, white nativism, transhumanism, and abolition feminism, the book reveals a mirage of dominant democratic thought and the false promises of liberal political ideologies, which proffer freedom, justice, and democracy on the one hand, while radically exclude difference and perfecting governing on the other. So, among other things, the book concludes that democracy as a paradigm has little conceptual efficacy, but as a praxis, now that's something else altogether. So cogently, the book insists that substantive justice needs democratic living for countering the many tyrannies in our lives, namely settler colonialism, white supremacy, gendered racial capitalism, including the neoliberal labor regime of death by work and violence of all forms. So let me pivot a little bit, not too much, and try to tease out the context and the inspiration for this work, and then I'll wrap up. I'm still good on time, right? Okay. So the recent reemergence of, and I said reemergence, of fascist and authoritarian politics in the United States and beyond compel me to ask questions and revisit long-cherished ideas and misnomers such as freedom, democracy, liberty, justice, and so on and so forth, And in an era of alternative facts and truthiness, how do we know what we know about these things, right? Freedom, equality, liberty, democracy, justice. Many reasonable people have taken these terms for granted, yet manage very little consensus. And as the book shows, these terms frequently mean the very opposite than what we think they mean. Especially in the lives of the majority and for those who are living precarious lives. And so, for instance, Chapter 5 concludes Part 1 with a broad interrogation of how liberty becomes so disconnected from justice. It delineates how the radical right's obsession with order is much older than the emergence of the various campaigns for law and order, which many credit them for the rise of mass surveillance and imprisonment. Here and elsewhere, I employ Black feminist reconceptualization of reproductive justice to expose modern Republican order-obsessed politics and delineates a more substantive understanding of freedom instead of an entitled liberty. And so I conclude that, quote, anti-democracy relies on authoritarian excesses, while a deformed liberty is one that reserves all for the few and nothing for the many. Moreover, when resistance to tyranny begins and ends with liberty, transformative justice projects are abandoned along with used-up dreams of freedom, close quote. So these concepts, liberty, democracy, whatever, are more than misnomers. They are what Enrique Drusel would call academic apparatuses. They're placed in the service of empire, of dominions, meant to inculcate obedience and unthinking for the express purpose of achieving pacification and containment dreamed up for perfecting governing. So democracy, for instance, is in reality anti-democracy. Here I extend Cedric Robinson's work arguing that much of what has been taught about and thought as democracy is hostile to democracy, democratic thought, and democratic living. This retooling allows me to illustrate how democracy is an ideologism and an academic apparatus. So here again is an extended passage from the book. So it is that we invented a series of untruths about democracy, mob rule, and the people, including the idea that left to their own devices, the people are incapable of ruling themselves. If only beasts and gods exist outside of governing, then ruling is norm and reified to the device of the social contract and naturalized by the fallacious idea that individuals and communities voluntarily submit to be governed, even by those who seek their total annihilation. The domination of the ungoverned becomes the first principle of government, and domination is thus self-mastery, oppression is bliss, and conquest is missionary. Democracy on the road to modernity, therefore, submitted itself to enlightenment and graduated to the status of anti-democracy. Not entirely unexpected, however, and just as the many of previous era announced their presence and disturbances, the demos of our time, with misgivings and mischiefs, staged their many insurrections to not only register their displeasure, but also to provide historical verifications of alternative ontologies, different live worlds, worlds where they, not the aristoi, not the elite, supply their own ideologies, myths, imaginaries, and ways of doing democracies. So, becoming ungovernable is also a direct response to the relentless media attacks and the multi-billion-dollar legislative campaigns against critical scholarship and critical thought, namely the counterinsurgency against critical fields of study such as ethnic, gender, trans, queer, disability, feminist, and justice studies, but especially against Black studies and Black histories. I felt that as a scholar, especially one who has been raised in and nourished by critical theories, critical Black feminist study, third world studies, and trans queer studies, I felt that I didn't have a choice but to marshal a coherent, robust refutation. Scholars, unless you are court scholars, and even some of those, would concede that censorship, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism are anathemas to thinking. For a long time now, I have been very troubled by the rise of nativism and xenophobia in the United States. Even prior to relocating to Arizona and when internet search was in its infancy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was already tracking neo-Confederate presence on the web, as well as in bulletin boards and listservs, including tracking the Arizona-based Minutemen Project when they started in 2004. Since then, there has been an undeniable reemergence of white supremacy, the proliferation, not reemergence, but a more mature and assertive articulation of white supremacy, the proliferation of hate group, and the entrenchment of, or I guess, enchantment with authoritarian ideas. Also, there has been a great deal of interest in the Black freedom struggles, including the movements for prison abolition, especially in light of BLM and movement for Black Lives protests in the aftermath of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others' deaths at the hand of police and prison guards. And as mentioned, a more assertive censorship campaign targeting critical thought and scholarship, one that many scholars, particularly in Middle Eastern studies, especially Palestinian study today, are experiencing more acutely, right? That campaign. And at the same time, there is also the fact that the younger generation are becoming increasingly more acute and astute about race relation, even wanting to do something about the long history of anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism, and white supremacy. So the current generational split in public opinion about the catastrophe in Gaza, for instance, is emblematic of this generational shift. This is also true of climate catastrophe. So the young folks are asking very hard questions about the present and future humanity, like what do we do to move toward a more just future? How can existing extreme wealth inequality be sustainable? What does planetary justice look like? Or how do we stop genocide? And they are not just asking questions. They are also showing us how we may go about doing things differently, how we may relate to one another differently, how we may value lives more comprehensively, more compassionately. So I wanted to explore these ideas and movements that push against normative thinking and ways of doing things, and consider proposals for how to get at really complicated questions and challenges that we face in contemporary life. And then, of course, there's feminisms, right? And feminisms, especially radically queer Black feminism, have always been so helpful in teaching us how to deal with complicated, complex things, and how to have difficult dialogues, and how not to reduce great challenges and difficult questions to simple answers as panacea. And so logically, I rely heavily on these bodies of critical scholarships and movement praxis, and the works by Toni K. Bambara, Sarah Ahmed, Sylvia Winter, Dorothy Roberts, Angela Davis, Yuri Kochiyama, Barbara Ransby, Adrian Piper, and H.L.T. serve as anchors and as accompaniments. And as some of you may know, my scholarship, including my film work, sits at the intersection of movement studies and radical theorization. So I think there's a great deal to learn about historical and contemporary stories of everyday people crafting and recrafting the communities and worlds in which they live. As a filmmaker of more than a quarter of a century, I have had the privilege of being the fly on the wall of many movement endeavors, and eavesdropping in on conversations with deep theoretical insights. These communities, formations, and individuals have shared profound understanding of people, power, and politics, including the lived experiences of academic ideologies, such as freedom, democracy, and justice. Not only have they leveled devastating critiques against normal theorizing, but they have also theorized and redefined academic sensibilities and philosophical imports. The uses and misuses of intersectional analytics is only but one example, right? In the book, I point to women of color struggles for reproductive freedom as a prime example of how movements for justice transform the meanings and praxis of justice as a paradigm. So, if pressed, I would say that the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, people like Sylvia Du Bois, Nancy Williams, Salaria Key, Yuri Kochiyama, the woman who invented and used the Nushu script, the Wokan villagers, the practitioners of abolition feminism, they inspired and compelled me to write this book. So, by way of concluding this unruly book talk, I will share a story about a book. I think in many ways, Become Ungovernable is a love letter to other books and critical scholarship. You may know that notations and references take up nearly a third of the book. And that was because after 100 pages of it was already cut out of it, okay? And I'm bitter about that too. Anyway, I really enjoy getting into those notes. Anyway, but the story I want to share is this, right? I ran across this little book called Sylvia Du Bois, a biography recorded by a Dr. C.W. Larison and edited by Jared Lobdell. And this book title stopped me on my track when I first ran across it. Sylvia Du Bois, a biography of the slave who whipped her mistress and got her freedom. Right? So the alliteration of Black oral English suggests a certain authenticity of her voice, a testimony of her life and fight to be free. But also a narrative recorded by an author who was an MD, and then there was the editor, Jared Lobdell. Now, my only prior knowledge of Lobdell's work was that he was one of the first Tolkien scholars, right? So the Hobbit and the Lord of the Ring Tolkien scholar, that Tolkien scholar, right? So this is weird, right? It's totally weird. So, you know, I'm no fantasist or student of fantasies. So I thought that was just weird. And then there was the foreword by the eminent historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, who told a story about an experience of the life of another young black woman, Phillis Whitley, and the birth of African American literature. That too was kind of odd, right? What was a doctor writing a story about a slave woman? Why did Gates feel he had to authenticate Du Bois' story by telling us about the story of how Phillis Whitley, a slave poet, known as the first published black author in the US, who actually went through an incredible ordeal, an attestation to prove that she did indeed wrote the poems? So as I continue to read the foreword, I learned that the foreword wasn't even about Sylvia Du Bois at all. It was about the black woman literary tradition and the Sombert Center for Research in Black Culture. In fact, Du Bois wasn't even mentioned in the foreword. And so that's weird, right? You guys, you think it's weird? Okay. I meant, why would Oxford University Press republished a biography, went through the trouble of getting Gates to contribute a foreword that didn't even mention the main subject of the book? There was something about that fact that bothered me so much. I carried that book everywhere I went, including into production, which over the course of several years, we clocked more than 26,000 miles, driving to various locations, right, finishing out the film that we recently completed, Queer, Broke, and Amazing. So anyway, there was this, you know, weird stuff. And then there was this not insignificant fact that Du Bois won her freedom by making herself ungovernable to the enslaver. And that she lived a really, really, really long life. I mean, like possibly over 100 years old. I mean, that was a really long life. So when I ran across the book for the first time, I have been thinking about ungovernability as a concept for a while, and how serious political scientists and theorists do not take ungovernability seriously as a concept. Then again, they also don't take all the people rule by the meaning of democracy very seriously either. And I wanted to take Sylvia Du Bois very seriously, certainly more seriously than Gates Forward seems to suggest. So I thought about the many women and men, the communities and formations I have had the privilege of encountering in my film work and my research, who have done extraordinary things, and they frequently did not conform to the order of things. People like Salaria Key, who fought fascism before being an anti-fascist was okay, and who understood very clearly that fascism was Jim Crow apartheid. People like Yuri Kochiyama, who experienced incarceration in the US-Japanese internment camp, whose father died of a broken heart after the FBI targeted him as an alleged spy, who grew up and inspired several generations of young people for her work, building alliances and communities, and her friendship with many radical, especially political prisoners. And the woman who invented an entire language that lasted possibly more than a millennium, so they could communicate with each other on their own terms about their lives and fights in feudal China. And of course, about the radical black women feminists who, in contemporary United States of America, who are insisting that we must rethink everything, especially concepts like freedom, like democracy, like justice, and especially safety, security, and livability, and do and redo things so that all of us, not only a few of us, could thrive, could survive, and thrive. So if it succeeds, I would like to think that Become Ungovernable is a modest attempt to retell some of these stories and the lessons we could learn so that we could survive and thrive, not as solitary individuals, but as siblings and friends, as communities and worlds and planets. Thank you, and I look forward to your comment and questions.
Thank you for that wonderful recitation. I feel like we could have done a bit better job preparing because much of what you just shared was going to be what I shared. So we're going to get to the Q&A a little bit quicker than I originally imagined, and certainly quicker than what our instructions gave us. But I mean, the book is a book, all right? And that's what it's about, and that's what I was going to talk about. And I'll just have to say that when I was asked to do this, I was thinking, this is really impossible, all right? I just started teaching this class and got graduate students that I'm working with, and I'm reading other people's manuscripts for presses. And I enjoy reading. It's like one of my favorite hobbies, and so I'm reading. Many of you probably have heard of this. Adam Schatz's Rebel Clinic. Franz Fanon's new biography just came out, and so when the email came, I said to myself, this shit better be good, And it turns out it is, It turns out it is. I mean, quite frankly, as I read the email, you really had me at Become Ungovernable. Like, it's something I've strived to do myself for a long before I even became an academic, and it helped me understand, parts of my own life that I've been trying to unpack of late. And so I really appreciate the contribution you've made, not just to the field, but to my own existence. So there's a community that was created even as I read this, and so I'm very appreciative of it. Many of you are aware, either through the introduction or other ways, that I'm a historian, and what really resonated with me was the way you laid out this history. I mean, just by the time I'd gotten to, basically halfway through, like 100 pages, I'm like, we're going to get fired and we're all going to jail. But it's okay with me. Like, as long as it's for a good reason, I'm all right with it. Because the way you deal, just as by way of example, the way you deal with Jefferson and Adams, right? It's, for a lot of people, it's like sacrilege. Like, how dare she? Of course, I was cheering, the whole time. And you're basically laying out, this is what they say, but here is what they do. And which of these is the more important of the two? Like, the words are quite pretty, but the way they play out in people's everyday lives are really different. And the example of, say, Gabriel's rebellion that you use, like, here are these folks who are going to rebel, and they're not going to get on ships and go back to Africa. Like, they're going to take over this specific geographic space and have a real democracy. And you lay it out and unpack it in ways that, as someone who's been teaching history for a long time, made me really jealous. So I appreciate that. And your, assessment of David Walker at the same time. Here's a guy who has a lot to say about Jeffersonian democracy and U.S. democracy in general, and winds up, we don't know this, right? I'm going to just claim this, but he winds up being killed for his trouble, right? They find him dead in front of his clothing shop, but he said so many things about so many people in leadership that resonated with these people that they banned his appeal, right? And of course, that just made it more interesting. I mean, I think we've seen some book bans here of late, and as much reading as I have to do, I've just gone, every time I hear a new book that's been banned, I go and buy it. And at some point, I'm going to assign it to my class and figure out how to get beyond that. So I just really like the way you lay out this history of what it is we have to do, because there are antecedents that show us how we can succeed and move that needle. Of course, my area of specialization is the 60s. And I really like the way you brought in, Angela Davis is all over the place in here. But I think a lot of people aren't aware of really how radical she is. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in my comments, but her friendship, just as an example, with George Jackson was phenomenal. If you are ever able to get into the archives at Berkeley and Stanford and read some of these letters. There's George Jackson wrote a book, Soledad Brother, and you can see those letters, but there are lots of letters that did make it into that book, and his exchanges with Angela, she's far more radical than I think what we realize and what we have been able to imagine. And of course, you share with us the life and history, not so much the life and history, but the actions that Assata Shakur took that landed her in a situation where, as you point out, 40, 50 years later, they're putting her on the FBI's most wanted list. And here's somebody whose intervention was mostly ideological, right? So, they are aware of how ideas proliferate, but how these ideas also get people to act. And one of, as you point out, one of the goals of putting her on the FBI's most wanted list, again, 4 or 5 decades after her incarceration and eventual escape, was to make other people afraid, make activists and would-be activists afraid, make you think, hey, if you do that thing, they're never going to forget you. They're always going to be on your trail. And so there's all that stuff. I had no idea about the Nushu women. I really, really appreciated how you wrote about that, and how was it Miss Magazine was trying to get this woman writing about it to do something that had nothing to do with historical reality, just for our own consumption needs to make it pop a little bit more. And she pushed back as much as she could, but the whole point was this was their thing. They are talking to themselves about themselves and their experiences, and it wasn't a situation where leaders of the community or men in general were saying, you can't do that, we're going to run you out of town if you do. Like, it was a perfectly acceptable way of being that this magazine didn't want put out into the world. And I find that very, very instructive, as I did all the labor protests in China. I'm an iPhone owner. And I remember reading about these things and hearing people talk about them. Of course, I've been on a college campus for a long time, but it made me feel so bad to be an iPhone owner. I mean, not just the Foxconn stuff that's going on, but the actual movement of people from one area of China to the next to make it easier for me to communicate with, the people I communicate with. It just doesn't feel good. And here's a book. A lot of times I try to get my students to find themselves in the things I assign. And you did that in spades for me. So you talk about Black Lives Matter being, and the movement for Black Lives being led by these feminists, these trans, queer people who have a much more expansive understanding of democracy than, say, Huey Newton did, right? Or Martin Luther King, for that matter. And I was able to find myself there. It made me think back to, there was this big conference in Cleveland. Black Lives Matter organizations, networks got together at Cleveland State University and had this big conference. And I'm obviously Black, but I grew up this way in Mississippi in a very patriarchal, misogynist, sexist space, right? And I carry that with me. And I only share that because I'm headed to the restroom, and these queer people have changed all the restrooms to anybody can go to the restroom, where I don't know that. And I walk into the restroom, and there are what I judge to be women in the restroom. And I go, whoa, what's happening in here? Because, the door said men, right? And I walk in there, and there are these women. I said, am I in the right place? I said, yeah, come on in. You're in the right place. And I was like, are you sure? And then they begin to ask me whether I'm sure, And I get a lesson right there on queer, feminism right there in the bathroom. And so the end of that story, though, is I go to another session, and somebody runs into the session. Again, I'm finding myself in your book. You write about this, but not this specific thing, right? But it actually happens in my life, how these folks are able to create this new way of being, this new understanding, and this new way of protesting. Somebody runs into this room, I'm in this session, and just says the word police. That's it, that's all they say. And everybody streams out of the room. And we go outside, and people are talking about what's happening, and maybe 2 blocks away, there's an incident that's gone down. And it turns out, I know what it is now, I didn't at the time. There was a 15-year-old kid sitting on the stoop. It wasn't his house, and he was drinking. A police officer showed up, harassed him, threatened him, and then actually slammed him on the concrete and was going to take him to jail. And there were these queer women who blocked the police car. And they needed more people to come out and help them block the police car. And, more people did. I was one of those women. And I saw several of the women I'd seen in the people I'd seen in the bathroom there. So, well, I'm going with, because I just got this lesson, right? I'm going with them. And of course, more police officers were called, more cop cars showed up, and there was this discussion about what happened to the kid, and we're not gonna let him. That's what these queer, trans people are saying, we're not letting you take them to jail. You're going to call his mother, and his mother's going to come get him, because they had talked to the kid, and you're going to let him go. And the police is like, what? We're not doing that. And so they start, the tear gas business and spraying people. And of course, folks are hurt and there's pandemonium, but we don't leave. And more people come out of the conference, and then more cops come, and then there's the ambulance, and then there's the fire truck. But it winds up being more of us than them. And so just imagine this huge group of well-armed police officers and this other huge group. Nobody is, as far as I know, in this group is armed. And they're saying, we don't care how many of you all there are. You're not taking this kid anywhere. And this unfolds over a period of a couple of hours. And sure enough, they decide it's too much trouble. His mother shows up at the end of this 2 hours, gets him out of the police car, and takes him home, right? And so now that's the victory, right? Or so I think. And the police are trying to disperse the crowd. And this group of queer women are like, we're not going anywhere. So the sessions that were going on inside of the buildings where people came out are now taking place in the street. And they wouldn't let the police leave. They wanted to show them how it felt. And when their session was over, that's when they left. And so I was like, I'm all right. And so the way you write about that reminded me of that story. And these things really do happen in real life. Even the history you share about Yuri Kochiyama, you mentioned her friendship with Malcolm X and her insistence on friendship being a part of movement strategy, which is just ingenious as far as I'm concerned, because if you've ever taken part in a movement, right, very unpleasant things happen to you. It's not just harassment in jail, but other types of things. And I found myself in this part of it as well, because I'm working on a book now. It's a history of the San Francisco 8. And the San Francisco 8 are former members of the Black Panther Party who were arrested in 2007 for a police homicide that took place in 1971. So 35, 36-year-old crime. And I'm in San Francisco doing research, working with these people and their supporters. And one of their supporters, David Johnson, who had been a member of the San Quentin Six, during one of the breaks was like, I want to introduce you to one of my friends. And, I was like, I'm good. I don't really want to meet your friend. It's like, no, I think you'll like him, and so come on and go with me. So I did, right? But I really did not want to go, and he took me to Yuri Kochiyama's house. That turned out to be his friend.
She was active in San Francisco 8.
Yes, she was very active, and he left me there. Like I hadn't known. I mean, I knew Yuri through books, through that famous picture of her on the stage with Malcolm and some other things. But he was like, "I'll be back," and 4 hours later, I mean, Yuri and I, yes, were friends. She really is. I told her what I was doing, and there were several archives I did not have to go to because of this. And she really was the archive, and we corresponded via email, handwritten letters. I went back to see her quite a bit, and you don't really get that kind of thing from the average activist. And so when you wrote about the value, the importance and the significance of friendship and movement building, I was like, was she like spying on me? Did she know that this thing happened? And it was just super cool. And so those are the kinds of things that made the book good for me. There are also other things. You talk about the Black identity extremist situation. Perhaps you've heard of the counterintelligence program run by the FBI back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that really quashed the civil rights and Black power movements. We talk about how to measure success, but they could have been far more successful had COINTELPRO not done what it did. And so here comes the Black identity extremists after Black Lives Matter starts to make the rubber meet the road, and it's completely made up, right? There's no black identity extremists. I don't think. I mean, I have a black identity, and I am extremely opposed to oppression. Then I guess that would make me an extremist. And they talk about people who are likely to be violent against the government, right? And I think all of us are likely to be violent, and we're just as unlikely to be. But it really depends. If I decide to get up and slap somebody in this audience, they could be nonviolent until that point. And then that's kind of the end of their nonviolence. But it's a completely made up thing. And what I mentioned the San Francisco 8, right? What happens to me is I get stopped over and over and over and over on highways and byways because I'm working with these people that they consider terrorists, that they consider extremists, and I'm trying to help them not go to prison for life. And so I'm kind of looped into that. And so I get to know that situation intimately. I mean, I'm writing this book, as I mentioned, and I have a chapter called My Very Own FBI Agent, right? And this, I go through the airport and, I'm caught for whatever reason. Actually, the reason is I have a bunch of books that they don't like. And they call the FBI because they say anytime there's a gun situation, like, we have to call the FBI. Well, the gun situation was a picture of a guy holding a gun on the book. So here I am in this room, and this guy has my book, and he's reading from it, and he goes, "You don't like the FBI very much, do you?" I say, well, I mean, I don't, but what's the point of that question? He says, well, you say here, blah, 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 and you were just talking about footnotes. And I say to him, every single thing I say about the FBI, I got from the FBI. So perhaps the FBI doesn't like the FBI very much. He didn't like that at all. I mean, he slammed his hands down on the table and it's like, Mr. Austin, you have to take this seriously. And of course, I could not take it seriously at all, because I knew that it wasn't a crime to do what I was doing, which was going from one place to another with some books. I think that's still allowed, so I couldn't take that seriously. So anyway, I was able to find myself and my students and my life in this Become Ungovernable, and really to get an understanding of abolition and abolitionist feminism in a way that I'd never imagined. Like, I obviously have colleagues who talk about these things. I try to read as widely as I possibly can, but this actually has turned on the light that has been off for a very, very long time. And so I want to, end it there and ask questions. And my first question really is about the title. Like, can you help us understand, not so much how you came up with the title, which would be fine if you want to share that, but kind of unpack the deep meaning of that, because it could be, let's just face it, if you've read the Patriot Act, and I have, it could be a violation of law.
It could.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have disclaimers. I started with disclaimers.
Yeah.
Yes, so, well, as I said, I have been, first of all, I just want to say thank you for that lovely. Can you use the microphone? Oh, yes, of course, sorry. I just want to say thank you for that really lovely engagement with my work. I feel like if that's all I ever hear about this, I'm okay. I'm really good.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really good. It's just so kind and so generous. And really, I feel like whatever the challenges, some of the things that you share about how you saw yourself in it, that I gave voice to some of the events, if that's all I manage, I feel like it's been totally worth it. So I just want to say thank you. And I'm also jealous that you got to spend 4 hours with Yuri. I've spent more than that, but never at once. Because
Okay.
you're always so running around. So become ungovernable. I have been interested in ungovernability as a conceptual, ungovernable as a conceptual framework for a very long time. And it is a fact that in political science, they think that term is nonsensical. And as my friend Barbara Rensby, the historian, recently reminded me, the first time she heard that term was within the context of the anti-apartheid movement, where in which the black activists, the black consciousness movement activists, announced that they would make that country ungovernable for the apartheid regime. And so that's the spirit in which I think about that we are not available for governing. And that, of course, itself is an extrapolation and perhaps an acknowledgement of Toni K. Bambara's intellectual influence on me, because, of course, she famously wrote that we need to make ourselves unavailable for servitude. And so I extrapolate that to also, therefore, becoming unavailable for governing. I have to say, for 3 years, I worked with this manuscript that is actually a draft of manuscript that's actually called Against Tyranny. And so the subtitles remain the same, An Abolition, Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living, because all of those things are important to me. But the title, Against Tyranny, was in many ways drawing attention to all of the things that I was mentioning, as white supremacy, anti-black violence, racial gender capitalism, settler colonialism, and so on and so forth. But the book was really about becoming ungovernable. And so my friend and publisher, David Shulman at Pluto, suggests that I consider changing it to become ungovernable. Because before I said, I had proposed that if they didn't like Against Tyranny, I would say Becoming Ungovernable. So that was the title. And he said, no, let's have it Become Ungovernable. And I said, you do marketing, I write the book. Do whatever you want. So I can't even take credit for the book. I'm just telling you. I can't even take credit for the title. So it's, and I have to say, you know, I'm not really that invested in my own verbiage. I think that's how I would say it. And so for me, but I do believe that, so one of the things that I finally sort of conceded, the reason why I like it is because Become Ungovernable, as you deviously suggest, that it is not becoming ungovernable. It is become ungovernable. It could be read as an exhortation or a calling for rioting, you know. So yes, in some environment, it could be an illegality. Let's put it that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does that answer your
It
question?
really does. It really does, and it helps take us to the next place, because it reminds me of this history of this black woman in Mississippi. Her name was May Bertha Carter. Mm. And May Bertha Carter lived in a small town in the Mississippi Delta called Drew, Mississippi. And in 1965, the state of Mississippi passed something called the Freedom of Choice Plan. You know, mm-hmm. The Civil Rights made segregation, the Civil Rights Act made this segregation illegal. But of course, you know, they wanted to maintain segregation, and so they created a state law that said, under freedom of choice, you can send your children anywhere you want to send them, right? And May Bertha Carter decided to send her children to what was then understood to be the white schools. Mm. And May Bertha Carter, like the overwhelming majority of black Mississippians, lived on somebody else's land, lived on this plantation. I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Thornton's plantation. And Mr. Thornton sent people to Miss Carter's house and said, hey, you know, you might get evicted if you don't take your kids out. And she was like, okay, you know, but she didn't take her kids out. And then he sent a second person, and she was like, okay, you know, evict me. And then she actually sent he actually sent her husband. Like he got her husband to try to convince her. Now May Bertha Carter and her husband have 9 children, right? And he's like, you got to talk to this woman, you know. And he does. And May Bertha Carter is like, listen, you know, you go tell Mr. Because since Mr. Thornton is sending you to tell me something, you go tell Mr. Thornton that I don't tell him where to send his children to school.
There you go.
And so he's not going to be able to tell me where to send my children to school. And I'm actually going somewhere with this, believe it or not. That night, these night riders come by and they shoot up her house. You know, nobody is injured or killed, but it's a very scary thing to be living in a, you know, shack of a place out in the middle of a cotton field and people are shooting at you. And, you know, the news media came out because they knew, you know, here's this woman who sent all of her kids to the white schools, right? And one of the interviewers, one of the reporters asked her, you know, well, aren't you, like, these folks just shot in your house, aren't you afraid to die, you know? And her response was, you know, we only have one time to die. Like, if you let people tell you how to live your life, you're already dead. And so when I read your book, it reminded me that May Bertha Carter decided to become ungovernable. And all of her children wound up graduating from, of all places, Ole Miss. Like, not only did they finish high school in that white school, but they all wound up going to the University of Mississippi and are doing quite well as we speak. And so there's some real historical examples of how to become ungovernable.
There are a lot of them, though, aren't there?
Quite.
I can just sit here and listen to you because you are a historian. I mean, I could ask you a question and you could just tell us all these things.
No, but here's my question about that. And actually, it gets, for me, to what I would consider one, and there's several, one of the many elephants in the room. But you say at some point, and I've got it marked somewhere, but I don't have my little tabs. But at some point in the book, really toward the end, you say that abolition feminism is against all forms of violence, right? But, you know, 100 pages before that, you show us how they're able to maintain order, how they're able to convince us that we are living in an actual democracy. And these ways are actually quite violent.
Absolutely.
And I am just curious. Actually, I do have it on 166. We can talk about this in a little bit more detail. Whether the kind of democracy that you're encouraging us to consider and that other activists, Davis, Sylvia Winter, and all the others that you mentioned are encouraging us to consider, does this, here's the elephant, does this preclude the use of violence in solving some of the problems we face?
I think that's a very fair question. And I think it is a question that I don't have a clear answer to. So, I told you I'm honest. About my modesty anyway. So I think this, on the one hand, I think it's important to understand that we live in an extraordinarily violent time. Not just the past. This is not just something that happened before, but this is happening now. I mean, if you wonder, just turn on TV and look at what's happening, what is being done to Gaza. And what is being done in various parts of the world, including the west side of Phoenix for the folks who don't have air conditioning and things like that. So it's extraordinarily violent. And so what does it mean then to proffer a potential solution as a way to deal with it? Now, I think that feminism, abolition feminism, is especially astute about addressing systemic, state, and intimate violence. I don't think that abolition feminists deny that there is violence. I do think that there is a host of tactical choices. I don't know that if violence means the total revolution, the overthrowing of the state, I don't think that that is what they are concerned with, because I think that they think that those are the terms of order. I think that they are a very ambitious group of people. They're not just interested in talking to us about the way in which violence intimately affects us, but the way in which our community, our society, the planet that we are inflicting violence upon and on each other. And so they are concerned about planetary existence. So they talk in terms of ecological terms. So it's extraordinarily ambitious and capacious. And if you think in those terms, if you think in terms of ecological, forest fires at one level is a natural phenomenon, right? At one level, and in fact, it would in fact replenish soil. So I don't think that they deny certain phenomena. They also they're realists, so they're not like a bunch of wide-eyed Pollyanna. So when you, for instance, when you talk to people like Davis and Beth Ritchie and others, they are very clear about both programmatic and systemic violence. They're also very clear about the way in which the responses, democratic responses, the way we live with each other has to be free of violence. I think that's, so whether or not the revolutionary repertoire that include the right to self-defense, I think people believe in self-defense. I think all of these activists I interview all over the country believe in the right to self-defense. What I don't know that they believe in is whether or not they think that overthrowing the state with violence would resolve some of the existing conditions. We also know that if we are trying to compete with the state and corporation, we will be outmanned and outgunned. That's really the issue. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important for those of us who live in mostly violent, especially military violent free society, not free but temporarily cordoned off, let's call it that, because it's not free. I think sometimes we speak about nonviolent strategy with certain kind of privilege and self, gratification that belies the fact that often people are resourceful and they make available to themselves whatever tools available to make themselves ungovernable.
Thank you. Okay. Very, very much appreciate that. And I'm going to ask one more question, and we'll get you all involved and the people who are also on Zoom. And it's definitely related to just pushing a little bit more of this envelope. So I read the piece on Foxconn and the labor protests against Apple about a week ago. I got to that piece, and it resonated so deeply with me. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this, but I went out and bought a light phone. And it's just kind of fun. It's kind of like a flip phone, but not a flip phone, and you can talk on it.
Right.
There's a phone.
Just a phone. Phone, it does what it's supposed to do. Yes.
And you can send text messages, but that's all you can do. So that's how deeply resonant your work was for me. Like, I've had an iPhone since there's been iPhones, right? But I did not like being complicit in what was going on. And where I'm going with that is, are there things that you can point out in the history or in the strategies that these feminists have used, examples of non-cooperation, which is kind of what I thought I was doing when I did this last week, that we can all follow up on ourselves. Like, and it probably more likely than not is nonviolent, but are there areas of not cooperating with the system that we can start with now that would make us ungovernable?
I think there are, obviously, there are so many examples. So, for instance, many of the activists, the anti-authoritarian activists in China, they can't afford, but they also operate in a kind of parallel universe. On the one hand, they're incredibly sophisticated with social media, but on the other hand, they don't actually use some of the more commercial products. Second, we experienced this a lot during the pandemic, when mutual aid and solidarity networks have really, in many ways, made it possible for many people in the community to survive. So there's that. One of the group that we just so sad we weren't able to include them in our film Queer Book and Amazing is a group based in Oakland. They're called People's Medic. And so what they do is they respond to medical emergency in community, poor, mostly black and brown community, because they don't want people to have to call the police on those calls, because often those people get killed. And so they train their community people with skills and so they call themselves People's Medic. And we just so sad that we didn't get to include them in our film. We interviewed them, all that stuff, so we're probably gonna do like a little short and put it on YouTube or something. But they do amazing, amazing work. There are folks in Puerto Rico who completely, because of the hurricane, because of the pandemic, they don't participate in what you would call the normal exchange extractive system. They do sharing, they share resources. We know a guy who literally only barter, and he's not alone. There's a whole group of people. So you go out and eat, you bring him lunch. That's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. So that kind of thing, and he trained the kids skills so that they have a skill. And so then they can then do things in the community. So what I want to say is that if you look at particularly the food and land sovereignty movement in the Global South, there's a whole repertoire of people who are living in the margin that are doing these things that, yes, they do know and they do have to participate at certain level in the formal global economy, but in everyday life, in the quotidian reality, they disrupt the system, and that's when become ungovernability isn't about large scale, but it can also be small scale.
Okay, that's very good. And I said that was my last one, but just want a quick follow up on another potential example, because I'm thinking of a personal relation that I have that also fits this, and I'm just curious, like in a much larger way, like whether the feminists you write about, the abolitionists you write about, would think it's even practical to do what I'm about to say here, because you do, and I don't want to give away the book, but you do lay out in the early part this notion that we have consented to be governed, and this is how.
Or they say we have consented.
Or they say we have, and you elect this person, and that's your representative, and they go to Washington, and then they do what you want them to do, which obviously is not exactly how it works. And I said a personal relation. I have a high school classmate who's now the mayor of the town I grew up in, and when I talked to him, he says it's just absolutely impossible to make changes because of the way things work. Mm-hmm. He has good ideas and he's got good people around him, but he can't implement them because of the way democracy works in this little town. And I'm calling it democracy in a very euphemistic and kind of side-eyed way. Would these feminists think that not cooperating, and I'm probably going to upset some people in the audience, or at least have them give me the side eye, with the election process? Like if we decided that we now know that there's no real difference between the two contenders. So what I usually, long before now, what I usually say to my students when we start talking about the electoral system is the difference between the systems in the United States and Russia is, in Russia you have a choice of one man, and in the United States you have a choice of two men. And some of them don't find that funny, but I do. And so I'm just curious of these radical feminists, like they know what you know, they know what you've laid out, they know this history that we haven't actually consented to be governed. Yeah. So would they agree that this would be a good strategy? This non-participation? Yeah.
I think sometimes non-participation is resistant. I think that we do understand at the same time. So this is why I think abolition feminism is interesting, right? Because people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, people like Charlene Carruthers and others, they actually are very pragmatic and practical people. They know elections have consequences, right? There's this thing called electoral justice, and I think that some of those feminists are working on that to sort of ensure that politics isn't being, normal electoral politics isn't just being dictated by big money, that there are people who can make a minimal change, but they are not, I don't think that they would believe that electoral politics is going to give us nirvana or salvation or whatever term that you want to call it. It's not the promised land, that's for sure. We know that in every election. But at the same time, I think part of the reason why I'm saying this is a practical and ethical stance is that it allows us to negotiate the space in which we want to contest. In other words, you know, as Barbara Smith probably said it to so many people, you all know it by heart, we can't wait around for the revolution. Those of us, if we wait around, they might come and kill us while we're waiting. And so we don't have the luxury of waiting for total systemic change. We have to affect change where it occurs, and it starts with us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Do you mind giving that to HQ? Sorry. So we don't have that much time left, but we do have a question on Zoom. So we're going to take that one first, and then maybe 2 in the audience. 2 or 3, depending on how quickly people can speak. Okay.
All right, so our first question asked, could you say something about how we become ungovernable within higher education?
Well, some people believe that higher education, the only way to become ungovernable is to be a criminal, to go into the undercommon, to perform illegality. I certainly think that subterfuge it has been my primary mode of operation. I think the more we are afraid, wherever we are, be it in the university or in the hospital or in a prison, it isn't going to free us. So we might as well do what we are passionate about, and hopefully what we are passionate about is partially about radical change. I think if nothing else, the university, higher education, is a space that has resources. There are many spaces and communities that have no resources. People who work with people inside know this. Sometimes just a stationery that says you are Dr. So-and-so could make a difference in the lives of a woman inside. And so I don't have the luxury of waiting around for total change as Trustee would have liked. But I do think that we need to understand that our work, our present, are constantly being co-opted, appropriated, and sold for the purpose of containment and repression. And we are complicit in genocide, in incarceration, and in imperial knowledge production. This is why the task of any scholar is to subvert normative science and knowledge production. I think that's the only way I make peace with myself. I'm sure some of my dear friends and colleagues would say it's still reformist. Well, I think reforms for the purpose of counterinsurgency is bad. I think reform that has its abolitionist in nature is livable. And I'm okay with that.
Questions in the audience?
Hi, HQ. Really looking forward to reading the book. I wanted to ask, actually kind of following on your answer, how are you, so this debate that I know abolitionist scholars have, which is how do you think about this tension between ungovernability and the argument that racial capitalism has already accounted for us? It commodifies movements, it sells them back to us, it gives us these sort of shallow visions of diversity and inclusion, as we also see in the university, while also profiting from, extracting rare earth metals from mines in sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. Phone companies, that would be the example. So yeah, I guess if you could talk a little bit more about your philosophy about sort of how to stay ahead of that, I guess.
Thank you. And part of the thing I want to convey in the book as well as in the work that I do is that one of the things that I will not concede to is that the state or capital, so racial gender capitalism or colonialism, I refuse to concede that they, or whatever it is, has achieved total or perfect governability. One of the arguments I make in the book is that, in fact, perfecting governing is a fool's errand. Historically, and I think that Curtis is probably in a better position to answer for me because he's a historian, is that I think anyway, I have enough evidence, some evidence to show that historically, no system has achieved total control very long. One of the stories I tell is about the Han Dynasty, which has been in power for 400 some years. That's a long time. You guys think, 8 years is a long time. Okay. Okay. And these rebels, these crazy rebels, they helped create the collapse of this supposedly one of the greatest dynasty. Perfecting governability is a fool's errand. So I refuse to concede that capital or any kind of dominion can dictate to me all of the term of my life and expression. And that way, yes, some of our things are affected and caused by gender racial capitalism, by white supremacy, and so on and so forth. But we also have our own different weird ideas about who we are in our lives and how to interact with each other. And I think the minute in which we concede that all of our identity, all of our expression, everything we do is dictated by this one system of domination or another, we've already lost. We've already lost.
Oh, yeah. That seems like a really good place to end because it was very powerful, but we're going to take one more.
Sorry, this is just a comment ish. So, because I have independent reading conference session with Dr. Quan back 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, and I during one of the conversations, she introduced me this concept of become ungovernable, and this really inspires my work about rural migrant women's grassroots organizing in China, in contemporary China, in a politically closed, unthinkable place. So I really appreciate the capacious conceptual framework of become ungovernable because it is instead of use the U.S.-centric democratic universalization to explain other historical or contemporary lives as some sort of democratic, such as the Miss Magazine's misinterpretation of Nushu. You sort of creates a space of radical translatability between different modes of ungovernable life, and I think this is really, and it pushes us to think about it, especially for scholars in a politically relatively unclosed context to imagine ungovernable in the most authoritarian contexts. I think that's really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Did you have something else you wanted to say?
I just want to say again, thank you, everyone, especially Michael and
Muriel.
Sorry. You can thank Jesus too.
I don't think you want to do that.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, you folks. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you both. It was really delightful.
And see the exhibit. Walk through the exhibit.
Say that again, please, because that's what I was going to say.
Please make sure you walk through the exhibit, spend some time lingered. It's an extraordinary experience.
Thank you very much. That was my last message. We schedule these talks so that people can come to the talk and then go see Twin Flames. So I encourage you all to go and see it before you leave if you haven't already. And hopefully we'll see you on April 4th or April 25th when our next two talks, the second and third talk in the Twin Flames speaker series, will be taking place. Thank you all for coming today. It was delightful to have all of you here. Thank you.
You are amazing.